Abundance. This video is based on key insights from the book Abundance by Ezra Klein. Introduction. Ezra Klein begins by painting a picture of 2050, a world remarkably different from today. He imagines a future powered by clean energy solar, wind, and even small nuclear plants. A future where water scarcity is solved by easily turning seawater into fresh water, and where food is grown in towering indoor farms, reducing the need for vast fields. Meat isn't raised on sprawling farms, but grown in labs, lessening the impact on the environment. This isn't science fiction, Klein argues, but a possible future if we choose to build it. He highlights how his parents' generation relied on dirtier energy sources and faced real shortages, contrasting that with the potential for abundance in the coming decades. The core idea of the chapter is that scarcity isn't a natural state of the world, but a choice. Klein points out that we often know what we need to do to improve life for everyone: build more affordable housing, develop cleaner energy, find cures for diseases, but we simply don't do it. He uses the example of California, a state run by liberals struggling with homelessness and high costs of living despite its wealth and progressive policies. This isn't about a lack of resources, but a failure to actually build enough of what people need. It's like giving someone money to buy a house when there aren't enough houses to go around. The money doesn't solve the problem, it just drives up prices. Klein challenges the traditional economic idea of supply-side economics, often associated with conservatives who believe cutting taxes encourages production. He argues that for decades, both political parties have focused too much on demand, giving people money to buy things, and not enough on supply, actually making enough of those things. Democrats, he suggests, have fallen into the trap of trying to solve problems with subsidies, like giving people vouchers for housing or healthcare, without addressing the underlying shortage of affordable homes or doctors. This is like trying to fill a leaky bucket with more water. You need to fix the hole first. He uses the example of housing costs, which have skyrocketed while wages have remained relatively stagnant. This isn't because people don't have enough money to buy houses, but because there aren't enough houses being built. Similarly, healthcare costs have soared, not because people can't afford insurance, but because there's a shortage of doctors and medical resources. Klein believes that focusing on increasing supply, building more homes, training more doctors, developing new technologies is the key to solving these problems. Klein introduces the idea of abundance, drawing from the historian David Potter's work. He explains that abundance isn't just about having a lot of stuff, but about having the ability to create a better future through innovation and production. He contrasts this with the current consumer-focused culture, arguing that we need to shift our focus from simply buying things to actually making things. He envisions a future where technology like artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and advanced manufacturing allows us to overcome scarcity and create a more prosperous and sustainable world. The author criticizes both the right and the left. He acknowledges the right's focus on production, but questions their willingness to address issues like climate change. He then turns his attention to the left, arguing that their focus on redistribution and subsidies isn't enough. He believes that liberals need to embrace a building agenda, a commitment to actively creating the things that people need, like affordable housing, clean energy, and accessible healthcare. He suggests that a successful liberal approach must be about more than just helping people afford what exists. It must be about creating a future where everyone has access to a good life. Chapter 1, Grow. Ezra Klein begins by pointing out a funny thing about a famous piece of advice. Go west, young man. Horace Greeley, the person who supposedly said it, didn't actually go west himself. He built his life and career in New York City. This sets up a bigger idea. America has always talked about the frontier as the key to success, but its real growth has happened in cities. It's a bit like dreaming about finding gold while actually making money by building the tools that gold miners need. Klein explains that while the West felt like a solution to problems, cities were where people actually changed their lives for the better. They offered more opportunities. He uses the work of historian David Potter to show that more Americans improved their situation by moving to cities than by heading to the frontier. This idea is important because it challenges the common belief that open land is always the answer to a country's problems. The author then dives into how this belief about the West stuck around even when it didn't make sense. People worried that if America ran out of open land, it would stop growing. This fear even influenced thinking during the Great Depression. Economists like Louis Schwellenbach and Alvin Hansen believed that America's growth depended on having new land and resources to use. But Klein argues that this isn't true anymore. Economies grow through ideas, technology, and innovation, not just land. The important land is the land where new things are created, and that's usually in cities. This leads Klein to the current housing crisis. He points out that it's become incredibly expensive to live in successful cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Boston. A family can still find affordable housing in the West, but they can't easily build a life in these centers of opportunity. This is because of simple economics. When there aren't enough houses, prices go up. America used to be good at building homes, but construction slowed down in the late 1970s and hasn't fully recovered. Compared to other developed countries, the U.S. has fewer homes per person. This shortage has created a real problem. Almost 30% of adults are house poor, meaning they spend a large chunk of their income on housing. Many people have to commute long distances or take less desirable jobs just to afford a place to live. Klein highlights that economist Ed Gleiser found that wages in New York City used to be higher than elsewhere, even considering the cost of living. But now, moving to New York can actually mean taking a pay cut because housing is so expensive. Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg even described the city as a luxury product, not a place where everyone can afford to live. Klein acknowledges that some people defend high housing costs, arguing that if you can't afford to live somewhere, you shouldn't. But he strongly disagrees. Cities should be places where people can climb the economic ladder, not just for the wealthy. He believes that America is making the same mistake it feared in the 19th century, closing off opportunities for people to improve their lives. The author then shifts focus to why cities are more important than ever. He explains that technology has made distance less important. It's easier than ever to communicate and travel. Cities are, at their core, about bringing people and businesses together. While technology once threatened cities, it actually made them more valuable. Economist Ed Gleiser argues that proximity, being close to others, is more important than ever, even as connecting across distances becomes easier. Economist Enrico Morti explains that modern economies are based on ideas and services, not just physical goods. Companies like Apple and Microsoft create value through innovation, not just manufacturing. This innovation happens in cities, where people can collaborate and compete. He uses the example of Taiwan's semiconductor industry, showing how being close to production can lead to innovation. Klein emphasizes that cities are engines of creativity because they foster competition and collaboration. He cites research showing that people in large cities are more productive, even when factors like education and IQ are considered. Cities aren't just about density. They're about the unique ecosystems of people and industries that develop there. New York is the center of finance, while Silicon Valley leads in technology. These clusters are hard to replicate. The rise of generative AI companies, concentrated in the Bay Area, is a recent example. He points out that even companies that seem to operate globally, like Walmart, locate their innovation hubs in expensive cities because that's where the talent is. Even a frugal company like Walmart built an e-commerce center near San Francisco. The author notes that even with the rise of remote work, companies are bringing employees back to the office, recognizing the importance of face-to-face interaction. Klein then introduces a critical point. America is facing a great divergence. Cities are still engines of innovation, but they're becoming less accessible to people of all income levels. High housing costs are limiting opportunity, especially for those in the local service sector, jobs like hairstylists, nurses, and cooks. Economist Raj Chetty's research shows that upward mobility is declining in the U.S., and that growing up in a high-opportunity area significantly increases a child's chances of success. The author explains that this is because housing policies have made it harder for people to move to these opportunity-rich cities. He highlights a study by Peter Ganong and Daniel Shog, showing that income gaps between states used to close over time, but now they're widening. This is a reversal of a long-standing trend. He uses the example of janitors and lawyers, showing how housing costs have made it harder for lower-wage workers to benefit from living in high-income cities. Klein then turns his attention to the surprising role of liberalism in creating this problem. He notes that Americans often say they want one thing, but act in another way. He argues that a certain strain of liberalism, starting in the 1960s and 70s, has contributed to the housing crisis. He points out that many liberal communities prioritize preserving the character of their neighborhoods, which often means blocking new housing development. He explains the history of zoning, starting in the early 1900s as a way to separate industrial and residential areas. But over time, zoning evolved into a tool for restricting growth and keeping housing prices high. He contrasts Lakewood, California, a post-war suburb that rapidly built affordable housing, with Petaluma, California, which implemented strict growth controls. He argues that California has become a model for anti-growth policies, leading to a housing shortage and rising homelessness. Klein emphasizes that homelessness is a direct result of a lack of affordable housing. He cites research by Greg Colburn and Clayton Page Aldern, showing that homelessness is strongly correlated with housing costs, not factors like poverty, mental illness, or drug use. He argues that policies that restrict housing supply have unintended consequences, like increasing homelessness. He then criticizes the lawn sign liberalism that often prioritizes symbolic gestures over concrete solutions. He points out the irony of seeing Black Lives Matter signs in neighborhoods that actively resist building affordable housing. He explains how zoning laws and building codes have made it increasingly difficult to build diverse and affordable housing options. Finally, Klein connects the current crisis to the environmental movement of the 1970s. While environmental protection is important, he argues that the focus on preserving the status quo has had unintended consequences for housing affordability. He explains how laws like the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, have been used to block new development, even if it's environmentally sound. He concludes that America needs to rethink its approach to housing and prioritize building more homes in order to create a more prosperous and equitable future. Chapter 2, Build. Ezra Klein's chapter dives deep into why building a future free from climate disaster isn't just about switching to solar panels, but about fundamentally changing how we approach big projects and overcome obstacles. He argues that while technology offers solutions to scarcity clean energy, efficient systems, our political and legal systems are stuck in a way of thinking that makes progress incredibly slow and expensive. The core issue isn't a lack of ideas, but a lack of ability to actually build those ideas. The author begins by contrasting the traditional left-right political divide with the challenges of climate change. Usually, conservatives are seen as willing to take risks and embrace change, while liberals focus on preserving what we have. But with climate change, that flips. Conservatives often doubt the problem, while liberals are eager to conserve the existing climate. However, simply conserving isn't enough. Inaction means a drastically warmer future. Klein stresses that truly addressing climate change requires a massive rebuilding of the world as we know it. He introduces the idea of degrowth, a concept gaining traction on the left, which suggests rich countries need to scale back their economies while poorer countries grow more sustainably. However, Klein finds degrowth to be too radical and ultimately impractical. He believes it's less about climate and more about a deep philosophical rejection of modern society. blaming everything from capitalism to the way we view nature. He points to thinkers like Jason Hickel, who argue that our problems stem from a historical shift away from respecting the natural world. While acknowledging the depth of these concerns, Klein argues that waiting for a complete philosophical revolution isn't a viable climate strategy. We don't have decades to convince everyone to fundamentally change their worldview. A key example Klein uses to illustrate this point is meat production. He explains that half of all usable land is dedicated to raising livestock or growing their food. Reducing meat consumption would have a huge positive impact on the environment, but it's politically difficult. People enjoy eating meat, and attempts to restrict it are met with resistance. This highlights a central tension. Even if we know what needs to be done, political realities often prevent us from doing it. The author notes even proponents of degrowth shy away from truly radical changes like eliminating factory farms, opting for smaller steps like taxes on beef. Klein then shifts focus to the incredible advances in clean energy technology. Solar and wind power are becoming dramatically cheaper, and innovations like nuclear fusion offer the potential for truly abundant, clean energy. He emphasizes that the problem isn't a lack of solutions, but a lack of implementation. He points out that the world installed more solar power in 2023 than in the previous 63 years combined. Yet, realizing the full potential of these technologies requires a massive build-out of infrastructure, new power plants, transmission lines, and electric vehicle charging stations. This is where the chapter's central argument truly takes shape. Klein argues that America has lost the ability to build things efficiently. He contrasts the rapid infrastructure development of other countries with the slow, expensive, and often stalled projects in the United States. He uses the example of California's high-speed rail project, a decades-long saga of delays, cost overruns, and political battles, to illustrate this point. What should have been a relatively straightforward project has become a symbol of governmental dysfunction. The author explains that this isn't simply a matter of government inefficiency. It's a result of a complex web of regulations, lawsuits, and competing interests. He draws on the work of economists like Manker Olson, who argued that stable societies become bogged down in negotiations and compromises, making it harder to get things done. He also highlights the rise of adversarial legalism in the United States, where lawyers and lawsuits have become a substitute for effective government action. The environmental movement, while successful in protecting the environment, has also contributed to this problem by perfecting the art of saying no to projects, even those that could benefit the climate. Klein points to a surprising trend. Construction productivity has actually declined since the 1970s, while productivity in other sectors has soared. This is due to a combination of factors, including increased regulation, complex permitting processes, and a lack of investment in construction technology. He suggests that the system is geared towards preventing harm, but it's become so cumbersome that it's now hindering progress. Ultimately, Klein argues that we need to change our approach to building. We need to streamline regulations, reduce opportunities for legal challenges, and prioritize speed and efficiency. He suggests adopting models used in other areas, like the Base Closing Commission, which allowed for quick and decisive action. He acknowledges that this will require a shift in mindset, a willingness to accept some risk, and a recognition that sometimes getting things done requires making tough choices. The author concludes that the cost of failing to build a clean energy future is far greater than the cost of overcoming the obstacles in our way. Chapter 3, Govern. Ezra Klein's chapter dives into a surprising idea. Often, the biggest problems aren't about not having enough, but about how we try to manage what we do have. He uses the example of Tahanan, a supportive housing project in San Francisco, to show how things can go right when we rethink old ways of doing things. Tahanan was built quickly and affordably, a huge win in a city known for expensive, slow-moving construction because it used private funding. This meant it avoided a lot of rules and regulations that come with government money. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about city and state officials being willing to bend the rules to make it happen. This highlights a key point. Government isn't one single thing, but a collection of different parts that sometimes work against each other. Klein argues that we often get stuck in a false debate about big government versus small government. Both sides talk about what they want government to do, but often create policies that actually make it harder for government to succeed. He calls this everything bagel liberalism, where we try to pack too many goals into a single project, making it slow, expensive, and ultimately less effective. Think about building a new school. Everyone wants it to be eco-friendly, have the latest technology, create local jobs, and serve a diverse student body. That's all good, but adding too many requirements can make it nearly impossible to actually build the school. The author illustrates this with the example of semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. The government wants to bring this industry back home, but the rules for receiving funding are so complex and demanding, covering everything from environmental responsibility to workforce diversity, that it might actually discourage companies from building new factories. It's like trying to win a race while carrying a heavy backpack filled with good intentions. Klein points out that other countries, like Europe, negotiate drug prices to make healthcare more affordable, something the U.S. avoids due to fears about socialized medicine, ironically leading to higher costs overall. Klein uses the case of Los Angeles Proposition HHH, a $1.2 billion plan to build affordable housing for the homeless, to show how good intentions can go wrong. While the goal was admirable, the project became bogged down in regulations, delays, and high costs, ultimately building far fewer units than planned at a much higher price per unit. He explains that the need to secure multiple funding sources, each with its own rules and audits, created a tangled web of bureaucracy. It's like trying to build with Lego bricks while someone keeps changing the instructions and taking pieces away. He contrasts this with Houston, Texas, which has virtually no zoning rules. This makes it much easier and cheaper to build, leading to a greater supply of housing and a lower homelessness rate. While Houston isn't perfect, it demonstrates that simplifying the process can have a significant impact. The author emphasizes that the problem isn't necessarily a lack of money or good intentions, but a lack of state capacity, the ability of the government to actually achieve its goals. Klein highlights a crucial point. Government needs to focus on what it's trying to achieve and what is getting in the way. He uses the example of the I-95 bridge collapse in Philadelphia. When faced with an emergency, officials were able to bypass the usual rules and rebuild the bridge in record time. This wasn't about ignoring safety or quality, but about prioritizing speed and empowering those in charge to make quick decisions. It showed what government could accomplish when it wasn't weighed down by bureaucracy. Ultimately, Klein argues that we need a government that's willing to make choices, even difficult ones, and prioritize effectiveness over process. He suggests that sometimes, the best way to achieve our goals is to do less, not more. It's about recognizing that a government that chooses is a government that works, and that building a prosperous future requires a willingness to rethink old assumptions and embrace new approaches. Chapter 4, Invent. Ezra Klein begins this section by telling the remarkable story of Catalin Carrico, a scientist who faced years of rejection and hardship before her work on mRNA technology became crucial in creating the COVID-19 vaccines. Her journey highlights a bigger idea. Solving the biggest problems facing humanity won't come from simply doing more of what we already do, but from inventing entirely new solutions. This is especially true when dealing with challenges like climate change or disease, where simply managing resources isn't enough. We need breakthroughs. Klein argues that modern politics often focuses on distributing existing resources, but true progress requires creating new resources through invention. Think about it like this. Arguing over how to share a limited number of apples won't solve world hunger. We need to invent new ways to grow more food, or even create entirely new food sources. He points out that many things we take for granted today, like antibiotics or even toilet paper, didn't exist just a few generations ago. These inventions dramatically changed life for the better, and we need that kind of change again. The author emphasizes that invention isn't just about cool gadgets, it's the foundation of a better society. Things like Medicare and modern hospitals rely on technologies that were invented relatively recently. Making these things available to everyone is important, but we can't stop there. We need to keep inventing new and better solutions to improve lives. He uses the example of needing clean, jet fuel or ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere to combat climate change. These aren't things we can simply regulate or build our way out of. They require entirely new technologies. Klein then dives into why invention seems to be slowing down. He explains that science is becoming more complex, and it's harder to make truly groundbreaking discoveries. It's like climbing a mountain. The first steps are easy, but as you get higher, it becomes much more difficult. He introduces the idea of the burden of knowledge, meaning that as we learn more, it becomes harder to learn even more. However, he argues that a major part of the problem isn't the difficulty of the science itself, but the way the American science system is set up. The author points out that the National Institutes of Health, NIH, a major funder of medical research, has become overly cautious. It tends to favor projects that are likely to succeed, rather than risky, potentially groundbreaking ideas. This is like a sports team that only recruits players who are already stars, instead of taking a chance on promising rookies. He uses the story of Kariko as an example. Her work was repeatedly rejected by the NIH because it was considered too risky. This cautious approach stifles innovation and makes it harder to make the kinds of discoveries that could truly change the world. Klein draws a parallel to the creation of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, during the Cold War. DARPA was successful because it empowered program managers to pursue bold ideas without being bogged down in bureaucracy. These managers were like talent scouts, bringing together brilliant people from different fields to solve difficult problems. He contrasts this with the NIH, where scientists spend a huge amount of time filling out paperwork and following strict rules. He suggests that we need to experiment with different ways of funding science. This could involve giving scientists more freedom to pursue their own ideas, or creating new research organizations that are modeled after DARPA. He argues that we need to treat the science of invention as something we can study and improve, rather than assuming we already have the best system. It's like a chef trying out new recipes. Some will fail, but others might be amazing. Ultimately, Klein believes that a thriving future depends on our ability to invent our way out of the challenges we face. This requires a political movement that takes inventions seriously, and a willingness to experiment with new approaches to funding and organizing scientific research. He concludes by emphasizing that progress isn't guaranteed, but it's within our reach if we're willing to take risks and embrace the power of human ingenuity. Chapter 5, Deploy. Ezra Klein's chapter dives deep into why amazing inventions don't automatically make life better, and what the United States needs to do to truly build a prosperous future. He begins with the story of penicillin, a life-saving drug discovered by Alexander Fleming. While the initial discovery was brilliant, it took years of work and a massive effort during World War II to actually get penicillin made and distributed to people who needed it. This illustrates a key point: invention is only the first step. Turning an idea into something that helps millions requires a lot more than just a eureka moment. Klein argues that America has fallen into the trap of celebrating the invention itself, while neglecting the hard work of implementation, actually building, scaling up, and making new technologies widely available. He points out that the U.S. spends a lot of money on scientific discovery, but doesn't always do a great job of turning those discoveries into real-world benefits. It's like having a fantastic recipe, but never actually cooking the meal. He uses the example of elevators, which are surprisingly expensive to build in the U.S. compared to other countries, showing how regulations and a lack of focus on cost-effective production can hinder progress. The author highlights how the U.S. often overlooks the importance of micro-inventions, the small improvements and adjustments that are necessary to make a new idea truly useful. He uses Thomas Edison and the light bulb as an example. Edison didn't invent electricity or even the idea of a light bulb, but he tirelessly experimented with different materials and built the entire system needed to deliver electricity to homes. This tinkering, building, and scaling are just as important as the initial spark of invention. Klein emphasizes Wright's law, which states that as you build more of something, the cost goes down and quality improves. This means that actually doing things is crucial for progress. Klein then focuses on the story of solar energy. The U.S. was a leader in solar technology in the 1950s and 70s, but lost its edge when government support waned. Meanwhile, countries like Germany and China invested heavily in solar, learning how to manufacture it efficiently and drive down costs. This demonstrates how consistent policy and a focus on scaling up production are essential for success. He contrasts this with the U.S. tendency to start projects with enthusiasm, then lose interest and funding, leading to wasted potential. The chapter draws a powerful parallel to Operation Warp Speed, the program that rapidly developed and distributed COVID-19 vaccines. This was a success story because the government actively intervened, providing funding, coordinating production, and streamlining the approval process. It wasn't about a single brilliant idea, but about a massive, focused effort to overcome obstacles and get a vital technology into the hands of people who needed it. Klein argues that this is the kind of proactive, problem-solving approach the U.S. needs to adopt more broadly. Klein stresses that government has a crucial role to play in fostering innovation, not by picking winners, but by identifying and removing bottlenecks, the things that are holding back progress. He uses the example of medical school enrollment, which was artificially limited for decades, creating a shortage of doctors. He also discusses advance market commitments, where the government promises to buy a certain amount of a new technology, encouraging companies to invest in its development. This is like saying, if you build it, we will buy it, providing a guaranteed market and reducing risk. The author concludes by arguing that focus is a choice. The U.S. can choose to prioritize certain areas, like clean energy or disease eradication, and then dedicate the resources and attention needed to make real progress. He points out that crises often force us to focus, but we don't have to wait for a disaster to act. Leaders can choose to define challenges as national priorities and mobilize the country to address them. Ultimately, Klein believes that building a prosperous future requires a shift in mindset from celebrating invention to prioritizing implementation, and from relying on market forces alone to embracing a more active and strategic role for government. Chapter 6, Toward Abundance. Ezra Klein's concluding chapter argues that America is at a turning point, moving away from one way of thinking about politics and toward another. He begins by acknowledging the deep divisions in American society, noting that disagreements aren't just about policies, but about fundamental beliefs about how the country should work. However, Klein suggests that beneath these divisions lies an opportunity to build a new political order, one focused on creating abundance rather than simply managing scarcity. He draws on the work of historian Gary Gersel, who explains that American history is shaped by periods where hidden agreements between Democrats and Republicans create lasting political patterns. Klein explains that these patterns, or political orders, aren't about everyone agreeing on everything, but about finding common ground. The New Deal order, for example, lasted for decades because both Democrats and Republicans agreed the government needed to help people during tough times, like the Great Depression. Even a Republican president like Dwight Eisenhower supported programs that helped workers and built infrastructure, because during the Cold War, proving America could provide a better life for its citizens than the Soviet Union was crucial. This demonstrates how external pressures can sometimes lead to surprising cooperation. The neoliberal order that followed beginning in the 1970s, shifted focus toward individual freedom and less government control, again finding support across the political spectrum. According to Klein, both of these previous orders have now broken down. The Great Recession, the climate crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic have shaken people's faith in the old ways of doing things. He argues that this breakdown creates a chance to build something new, but warns that it could also lead to a more negative outcome. The author highlights the temptation of scarcity politics, where people believe there isn't enough to go around and become suspicious of others. He points to examples like arguments about immigration, where some politicians suggest immigrants take jobs or housing from American citizens. Klein emphasizes that scarcity thinking isn't limited to one side of the political spectrum. He notes that even in liberal areas, strict zoning laws can limit housing supply and drive up costs, contributing to the same sense of scarcity. He also points out that America's struggles to build things quickly and efficiently, compared to China, have led to a wistful admiration for China's ability to get things done. This comparison reveals a fear that America is losing its ability to innovate and build a prosperous future. Donald Trump tapped into this frustration, promising to bring back manufacturing jobs even if he didn't have a clear plan to do so. The author observes that Joe Biden, despite being a longtime Washington insider, also recognized the need to address these issues. Biden continued some of Trump's policies aimed at countering China's economic influence and invested in infrastructure, clean energy, and scientific research. Klein sees this as a potential shift toward a politics of abundance, where the focus is on creating more opportunities and resources for everyone. However, he cautions that simply passing laws isn't enough. The real challenge is changing the way people think and building institutions that can actually deliver results. Klein argues that a politics of abundance requires a new vision of the good life, one that focuses on solving problems through innovation and cooperation. He contrasts this with the scarcity mindset, which emphasizes competition and closing doors. He uses the example of the housing crisis, noting that the YIMBY movement, people who support building more housing, is gaining momentum. He also points to the climate movement's shift toward advocating for investments in clean energy, rather than simply focusing on sacrifice and restrictions. However, Klein acknowledges that building abundance won't be easy. He warns that outdated rules and regulations can slow down progress, and that there are competing visions of what abundance should look like. Some people advocate for degrowth, arguing that we need to reduce consumption to protect the environment. Klein suggests that this approach is too pessimistic, and that a more promising path lies in harnessing technology and innovation to create a sustainable and prosperous future. He draws a parallel to Karl Marx's idea that capitalism, despite its flaws, unleashed incredible productive forces. The goal, according to Klein, should be to direct those forces toward a shared abundance, rather than letting them be constrained by short-sighted interests. Ultimately, Klein concludes that the key is to shift the focus from what's lacking to what's possible. He calls for a new set of questions that drive political debate. Can we create more homes? Can we generate more clean energy? Can we build a government that actually works? He believes that by embracing a mindset of abundance, America can overcome its current challenges and build a brighter future. He emphasizes that this requires not just new policies, but a fundamental change in values and a commitment to institutional renewal. He ends with a hopeful note, suggesting that America has a long history of overcoming obstacles and that a politics of abundance is within reach. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.